Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're unraveling a truly fascinating and maybe often surprising story. It's right at the heart of one of the world's major religions. Imagine finding a hypothesis that really challenges long-held beliefs about its origins. Well, that's our journey today. We're exploring the early days of Islam and this compelling, sometimes controversial idea about its foundational Zionist roots. And that's through a group you might never have encountered, the Ebionites. And when we say Zionist here, we mean it in its original ancient sense, that deep Jewish aspiration for self-rule, for a return to the land of Israel. We've sifted through, well, quite a stack of academic research, historical documents, and some really fresh interpretations of religious texts like the Quran and even ancient inscriptions. Our mission: basically to distill the most important nuggets of knowledge from all this, giving you, our listener, a kind of shortcut to being truly well-informed on this deep dive.
Yeah, and to really grasp this incredible narrative, we first need to paint a picture, a vivid one, of the world back then. Late antiquity, specifically the 7th century CE in the Levant. This was definitely not a peaceful time. For 4 centuries, the mighty Sasanian and Byzantine empires had been locked in these intermittent but incredibly destructive military campaigns. The 7th century really marked the brutal climax of these long, just grueling wars in that region. And this constant instability, the insecurity, the hardship, it deeply affected people. Of course it did. They were seeking comfort, seeking understanding amidst all the chaos, looking for some sense of order, maybe even, an end to history. This eschatological hope, this idea of a final destiny, the end times, it was often fueled by apocalyptic visions of dramatic change. What's fascinating here is how this desperate desire, it wasn't just abstract thinking, it actually fueled concrete political and religious actions. These huge territorial shifts, they also created significant opportunities. They awakened these deep appetites for power, for freedom, among nations that felt oppressed, particularly the Arabs and the Jews.
Okay, so into this chaotic, expectant world steps this central, kind of little-known group that our sources really put a spotlight on, the Ebionites. We often think of Judaism as this single unified belief system, right? But the historical research we've looked at, it clearly shows that back in the 1st century, there was this vibrant plurality of religious movements in the land of Israel. You had groups like the Sadducees, the Pharisees, Essenes, Zealots. And as we moved into the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Judaism was really more of a spectrum of beliefs. It was far from monolithic. Among these diverse groups were people we call Messianic Jews. Now, these are Jews who recognize Jesus as the Messiah, and this is crucial, they emphatically did not believe that Christianity somehow superseded or, nullified the law of Moses for Jews.
Right. And within these Messianic Jewish communities, there were basically 2 main distinctions we need to understand. On one side, you had the Nazarenes. They shared the belief in Jesus' divinity, what theologians call high Christology. It's similar to what most Christian churches later adopted. However, they rejected Paul's teachings, the controversial ones about abolishing the law, and they continued to rigorously observe the Torah commandments. And then, crucially for our story, you had the Ebionites. Their Christology was low. What does that mean? Well, they believed Jesus was a purely human Messiah, the son of Joseph and Mary, born naturally, no divinity. Their main agenda seems to have been political, reinstating Jewish sovereignty with a Messiah from the house of David leading them. And like the Nazarenes, they also rigorously kept the Torah and its commandments. Now, it does get a bit confusing because ancient authors sometimes use Nazarene and Ebionite almost interchangeably, but our research helps clarify. There seem to have been 2 types of Ebionites. Pharisee Ebionites, who were quite similar to rabbinical Jews except for believing Jesus was Messiah, and then the Essene Ebionites. These are often considered the actual Ebionites. They integrated Gnostic influences, these mystical, knowledge-focused beliefs, and also ascetic practices like strict self-discipline. They were active missionaries, apparently took a critical approach to some interpretations of the Torah, and, interestingly, forbade wine. Many of their ideas, as we'll see, actually pop up later in the Quran. Oh, and the name Ebionite comes from Hebrew. It means poor or needy.
What makes these Essene Ebionites so remarkable, so different, is this profound self-perception they had. They saw themselves simultaneously as the only true Jews and the only true Christians.
Yeah.
It's this completely unique hybrid belief system that, well, as we're about to explore, seems to have had such a profound and, frankly, unexpected influence.
So that raises a really important question, right? What exactly was this hybrid group's ambitious plan, this messianic plan for Jerusalem and the Holy Land? The sources detail a really critical moment. It's 614 AD. The Sasanian king Sharbaraz conquers Caesarea. And this prompts 2 distinct Jewish movements to converge, aiming to liberate Jerusalem from the Byzantines. One group was rabbinical, coming from Galilee. The other was Ebionite from Transjordan. And here's where it gets truly astonishing. To the surprise and probably dismay of the rabbinical Jews, the Ebionites actually took possession of the Temple Mount itself, and they immediately tried to rebuild the temple, their hope, to provoke the long-awaited second coming of Jesus. The rabbinical Jews, however, weren't having it. They quickly expelled them from the mount.
Wow. Okay, but the Ebionites clearly weren't easily deterred. What happened after that setback? Well, many apparently migrated south into Arabia, but they didn't just, disappear. Instead, they started actively spreading their unique Zionist teaching again, that ancient sense of Jewish sovereignty to local populations there. And they were diligently gathering an army. Their goal hadn't changed: conquer Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, and finally receive Jesus the Messiah in his second coming. So in 629 AD, they made another attempt, a valiant one it seems. But they were stopped, defeated by the Byzantines in a pretty significant battle at 𝗤𝘂𝗃, southeast of the Dead Sea. Yet incredibly, between 635 and 637 AD, their Zionist plan achieved at least partial success. Aided by surviving rabbinical Jews, perhaps alliances shifted. They actually reconquered Jerusalem. They set about clearing the extensive war debris from the Temple Mount. And then on the site the Christians called the capital, they built this rectangular structure. It was designed to mirror the inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies of the ancient Jewish temple.
And while, specific details about the exact rituals in this newly built structure are a bit scarce, one scholar, Stephen Shoemaker, describes some fascinating elements he's pieced together from early accounts. This sanctuary, get this, was served by 300 ritual attendants and 200 gatekeepers, 10 for each of its dates. Plus, there was a staff of both Jews and Christians dedicated to just cleaning the sanctuary and providing lamps, goblets, things like that. The structure itself was only open for public worship on Mondays and Thursdays, which, as you know, were traditional Jewish Torah reading days. The rituals would actually begin the evening before. Attendants prepared this complex perfume. Then, on Monday and Thursday morning, they'd purify themselves, ritual washing, put on special ceremonial garments. Then they would rub the sacred rock, the one at the dome center now with this perfume, and burn incense all around it, letting the fragrance just completely envelop the rock. Only once the rock was fully suffused with fragrance would the curtains be lifted. A crier would call the faithful for prayer, and the public was then allowed in, but only for a brief time. Typically just 2, maybe 4 at most, prayer cycles. What this level of detail, this meticulous effort really highlights is the profound messianic fervor driving these Ebionites. Yet, despite all their efforts, all this preparation, the last and most important part of their plan wasn't accomplished. There was no second coming of Jesus the Messiah. And this pivotal failure, it fundamentally altered their path. Everything changed then.
So their most fervent hopes were unfulfilled. What happened then? What became of this incredibly driven group who had, actually rebuilt a form of the temple? Our research suggests a truly radical answer. It's suggested by about 640 AD, having lost their Jewish Messianic apocalyptic eschatological hopes. Most of the Ebionites as a distinct group largely ceased to exist. And here's the core, really intriguing hypothesis of this whole deep dive. They didn't just vanish into thin air. Instead, they laid the very foundations of a new conquering religion called Islam.
Exactly. And the textual, also the epigraphic evidence inscriptions that we've examined, it provides pretty compelling support for this idea. Let's start with the Quran itself. Our sources characterize it as, well, an ambiguous, often disorderly composition. They even note around 2,500 linguistic and stylistic errors. It appears to be written in a northern Arabic dialect, interestingly, not the Hijaz Arabic usually associated with Mecca, and it has a considerable number of loan words from Aramaic and Hebrew. And importantly, the sources suggest it's collecting its contents primarily from Ebionite sources. There are also significant historical doubts just about the original meaning of words and sentences in the Quran. Why? Because the oldest manuscripts lack the dots and diacritical marks that distinguish many Arabic letters, so reading them can be uncertain. And there are also these long-standing doubts about the text's integrity. Both Shiite and Sunnite scholars have, historically, made accusations about suppressed or altered passages. But what's truly fascinating here is the work of Patricia Crone, a groundbreaking historian of early Islam. She identified 4 key Quranic themes that, she argued, strongly point to a significant Ebionite contribution. First, the Jesus you find in the Quran is consistently portrayed as a prophet sent only to the Israelites, not to the Gentiles. Second, the term Israelites within the Quran seems to actually include Christians. Third, the messenger referring to Muhammad views Jesus as second in importance to Moses and as someone who confirms the Torah. And fourth, the Quran emphatically, repeatedly insists that Jesus was only a human being, not the Son of God, which is classic low Christology, perfectly aligning with Ebionite belief. And just for a surprising bit of quantitative data that really underscores this point, think about how often major figures are mentioned. Moses, 171 times in the Quran. Muhammad, only 4 times. And some scholars even question if those 4 might be later additions, interpolations. Furthermore, Jewish ancestors like Isaac and Jacob, they appear more frequently than the traditional Arab ancestor Ishmael. Even though the Quran is supposed to be revealed in Arabic, the key insight here really is how profoundly this suggests a different foundational narrative for the Quran, one deeply rooted in that Jewish Christian context of the Ebionites.
Wow. And this striking textual evidence, it's amplified even further when you look at the inscriptions, right, on the iconic Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. So in 685 AD, that quadrangular temple structure the Ebionites originally built, it was transformed into the octagonal shrine we see today. And its inscriptions, they're considered the earliest epigraphic proclamation of Islam. It's actually the very first time the word Islam even appears on a public monument. And the inscriptions on the interface, they are incredibly direct, powerful. They unequivocally demonstrate this low Christology and these really staunch anti-Trinitarian views, which aligns perfectly with what we know about Ebionite beliefs. For instance, you read things like, "O people of the book, do not exaggerate in your religion," and "The Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, was only a messenger of God. Do not say 3, refrain, it is better for you. God is only one God. He's too exalted to have a son." Another part says, "The Messiah will never disdain to be God's servant. O God, incline unto your messenger and your servant, Jesus, son of Mary." I mean, these aren't subtle hints, are they? These are clear, concise theological statements that directly echo the Ebionite understanding of Jesus. Right there, carved in stone in the earliest monumental architecture of what becomes Islam.
Absolutely. And if we connect all of this back to that broader concept of Zionism again, in its ancient sense, the Jewish aspiration for sovereignty in the land of Israel, it becomes even more compelling. This aspiration, it existed long before the 19th century political movement we know today. It surfaced throughout history, Babylonian exile, Maccabean revolt, and crucially, in those 7th century revolts we've just been discussing. The research points to specific Quranic verses that contain what it describes as direct Ebionite Zionist contents. Take verse 5.21. It states, "O my people, enter the holy land that God prescribed for you and do not turn the back." Or verse 17.104. "We said after him to the children of Israel, reside the land. When the promise of the last life comes, we shall bring you all joined together." These sound like direct exhortations to the children of Israel to inhabit and possess the Holy Land. They deeply resonate with those Ebionite aspirations we talked about.
Okay, but there's a key objection, isn't there? Often raised against this whole Ebionite hypothesis. It's the claim, usually from Western Christian authors, that this group simply disappeared after the 4th century. How does the research address that? Well, 𝗵𝗫 𝗀, again, offers a powerful counterproof. She highlights the discovery of a 7th century Coptic text. It was found in an Egyptian monastery called On the Life and the Passion of Christ. And this text directly debated the low Christological views of Jewish Christians, who were clearly still living, still active in Egypt at that time, in the 7th century. So this finding strongly suggests there's no real historical reason to just exclude their presence in Arabia as well. It kind of opens the door wide for their potential influence there.
Exactly. And if we connect that to the bigger picture, it actually helps explain the historical darkness that seems to surround Islam's earliest period. It also sheds light on why there's so little pre-Islamic archaeological or textual trace in Arabia, which is supposedly the cradle of Islam. The explanation might lie partly in the Islamic concept of the time of ignorance, or jahiliyyah. It's a term that appears 5 times in the Quran. This concept implies that everything that existed before the Quran's revelation was considered invalid and, in some interpretations, maybe should even be destroyed. The sources we looked at indicate that Caliph Umar, who ruled from 634 to 644, initiated what they describe pretty starkly as the most thorough ethnical and cultural cleansing one can imagine, where many past documents, statues, inscriptions were systematically destroyed, and Christians and Jews were in many cases killed or expelled from regions they'd lived in for centuries. And this pattern, this impulse perhaps, to dismantle or destroy what's considered alien to its beliefs, well, the sources observe that it seems to persist. They cite examples like the Taliban's destruction of the Buddhas of Bamiyan in 2001, or ISIL's destruction of archaeological treasures in Palmyra in 2015. So this historical approach, it contributes significantly to why we have limited pre-Islamic evidence from that specific region and time.
Right. And to bring in one final, really compelling piece of evidence that seems to tie a lot of this together. Let's look at this plagiarized text as it's described, meticulously studied by the scholar Shlomo Pines. Pines examined an 11th century treatise by an Iranian theologian, Abdul-Jabbar. The book was titled The Establishment of Proofs for the Prophethood of Our Master Muhammad. What Pines found was pretty remarkable. The chapter on Christianity in this work was fundamentally different from typical Muslim polemics of that era.
He concluded it could only have derived from a Jewish Christian community, specifically one holding Ebionite views, and that it was, in his words, awkwardly and loosely applied by 𝗵𝗵𝗆𝗃 for his own purposes, like kind of retrofitted. These texts, which Pines dated to no earlier than the 7th century, contained key elements we've been discussing. A strong attack on Christians for abandoning the Torah, pointed arguments against high Christology doctrines, an outline of early Christian history, and notably a hostile biography of St. Paul, who, as we know, was a figure famously rejected by the Ebionites themselves. It strongly suggests a direct lineage of thought, doesn't it? From Jewish Christian communities like the Ebionites, right into what became early Islamic texts.
So, yeah, what does this all mean for our understanding of history? You know, Ernest Renan, a prominent scholar 170 years ago, he confidently declared that Islam was born in the full light of history. The research we've examined today contends that this statement, well, couldn't be wronger, 𝗥𝗀𝗆𝗀𝗀. When we actually compare the historical sources for Islam, like Ibn Ishaq's biography of Muhammad, composed 70 years after his death, known only through fragments quoted centuries later, or the hadith collections dating maybe 190 years after his death, relying heavily on often unreliable oral tradition. The origins of Islam, particularly its earliest period, they remain shrouded in significant historical darkness. A lot of questions remain. This actually stands in contrast to, say, Christianity. Paul's letters date to just 1720 years after Jesus' death. The earliest Gospels around 66-70 AD, though even there, mind you, there's a period of at least 17 years historians know very little about. And other major religions like Buddhism and Judaism, they actually have even less contemporary historical data for their foundational figures. So the Ebionite hypothesis, while it's acknowledged as a conjecture by the sources presenting it, is put forward as perhaps the most plausible explanation for Islam's origins based on the available, albeit sometimes sparse, evidence they've gathered.
This deep dive into these surprising proposed origins of Islam, it really challenges us, doesn't it, to think differently about how history is written, how it's interpreted, and maybe even how it gets lost sometimes. It's a powerful reminder of the complexity, the ongoing historical debate that surrounds the very beginnings of major world religions, and how religious ideas can evolve, influence each other in profoundly unexpected ways, often kind of in the shadows of what becomes the official dominant narrative later on. This whole exploration forces us to consider the rich, often hidden tapestry of early religious thought in the Middle East. So what stands out to you from this exploration? Something to think about.